Welcome back. It is the fifth meeting that we have in the project of nation building in the world. We are very happy to have with us this evening Dr. Monique Zohachevsky from Brazil. Thank you very much that you have come with us. We are very happy to have you with us. Good afternoon in Brazil. It is 2:30 in the afternoon. Good evening to all of us here, 8:30 in Israel. And I would like to introduce Dr. Zohachevsky, who is going to talk about nation building in Brazil. With this lecture, we conclude our academic tour, which has started from the Far East, South Korea, then we continued to the United Arab Emirates, then to Turkey, last month to Zimbabwe, and now we are heading to the Far West, which is in Brazil. That now I realize that you have winter, and as I have been told, 20 degrees is winter in Brazil. It's a very nice winter. So Monique Zohachevsky holds a PhD in history, in politics and cultural assets from Getulio Vargas Foundation in Rio de Janeiro, with a semester of study spent at Bilkent University in Turkey. She held a postdoc position at the Getulio Vargas Foundation, where she also coordinated the Executive Education Program in International Relations. Monique is co-founder and senior researcher at the Study of Research Group on the Middle East, HEPOM, and visiting professor at the Brazilian Institute for Teaching, Development and Research, IDP, where she teaches courses on global history and public history. She is the author of two monographs, Eastern Tropics, Tropical Easts, Reflections on Brazil and the Middle East, and From Rio de Janeiro to Istanbul, Contrasts and Connections between Brazil and the Ottoman Empire. She collaborates with economic analysis and opinion texts for Brazilian media such as O Globo, Folha de Sao Paulo, Zero Hora, Globo News, TV Brazil, and CBN. I hope I pronounced it in a decent way. Welcome, Dr. Zohachevsky, to our research hub here at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism and the Azrieli Center for Israel Studies here in Israel.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, it's important disclaimer, as Gabriel said, I'm a historian from a BA, MA, PhD, and even a postdoc, but I'm a Brazilian historian that studies history and current issues of Middle East. So I lived in Israel, I lived in Turkey, and I pretend to say that they are the countries of my expertise. That's my effort to understand both countries mainly. My hard work here in Brazil is to try to explain, to teach the history, mainly a lot of Ottoman history for the Brazilian public, academic public and non-academic public. So to me, it's very important to present myself as an academic historian, but as a public historian as well. To me, it's very important to talk the Brazilian media. I believe that, especially now in this time of the corona, we have to go beyond the walls of the university. So now in this project that Professor Gabriel invited me, it will be an effort in the opposite position. So I will try to explain my home country, the history of Brazil. It's a kind of I try to summarize a lot of complex history of Brazil. I will share just one. I think it's important to have a map here, just a minute. So let's talk a little bit about nation building in Brazil. From the historical perspective, it's important to have in mind that in 1453, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, it was in the search of alternative routes to the east that Europeans arrived on the continent that they called later America in 1492. The specific part of America that we now call Brazil was discovered, that's a lot of discussion about this word discovered, by Portuguese sailors led by Pedro Álvares Cabral in April 1500. The name Brazil derives from Brazil wood, a wood that had a red ink that when it was extracted, it was used to dye noble clothing. So the red was the color of the nobles in Europe. The historian Luis Felipe de Alencastro, a retired professor from Sorbonne, a Brazilian one that now is living back in Brazil, and I had the honor to attend his lectures. He points out that only Ivory Coast, in addition to Brazil, are countries that incorporated into their name products that were explored in their territory. So it's the first peculiarity of Brazil. Until the beginning of the 19th century, Brazil was part of the Portuguese overseas empire that stretched across Africa, including Angola, Mozambique, and Asia, with an important presence in Macau and Goa. In the early years of the Portuguese dominion, Brazil was not so important to Portugal, as it was more interested exactly in India. They wanted the product, the exploration of the products, such the spices that were used then for food preservatives, medicines, and dyeing too. The initial exploration of Brazil took place through hereditary captaincies. The idea was to outsource the colonization of the territory, donating parts of this territory for families of Portugal to explore this in the first moment. Over time, however, the Portuguese crown brought back or nationalized these regions, especially when gold was found in the 17th century. They also explored sugarcane, and the work took place largely from the labor of African captives enslaved. So it's another very important topic. In 1808, in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal in Europe found itself under threat of invasion by France. So with the support of the British Navy, the Portuguese royal family moved to their possessions in the Americas. So it's very important to understand this in the Brazilian history as well. So the royal family left Lisbon and came to this colony at that time. So, and not just the royal family, they arrived with a lot of nobles and officials too. So the Princess Regent, Dom João VI, Dom John VI, passed to rule all the Portuguese overseas empire from Rio de Janeiro. Rio became a capital of this part of America, of the Portuguese America. And about 10,000 nobles and officials of the crown also moved to Rio, as I said. A national bank was created, botanical garden. So during the first years, the Rio, that was a sleepy city, received a lot of important institutions, not just for Brazil, but to all the overseas, Portuguese overseas empire. So the basis of Brazil's independence from Portugal were laid with this movement, and in fact occurred in 1822 through the declaration of independence by Dom Pedro I, Don John's son. So I don't know if you know this peculiarity of our history, that the royal family came here from here, all the overseas empire was controlled, let's say, but this movement was very important to bring here the idea of independence. So Brazilian independence is approaching the 200th anniversary next year in 2022. And there are some facts around this history that are worthy to have attention, to have worthy of attention, even to analyze part of the current conflicts and debates inside the country and regarding the surrounding region. The first of them is that when Brazil became independent, I have a map of Brazil, a current one, because I think it's very important to have in mind this huge territory. So keep this in mind. So the first of them is that when Brazil became independent, it not only maintained the monarchical institution, but also the same Portuguese dynasty, the Orleans and Bragança. So it's very important that in 1822, when Brazil became independent, we kept the monarchy, so we had a king, let's say, and the same royal family. This point is very important to understand how different is it from the rest of Hispanic America, which also became independent from Spain in the beginning of 19th century, fragmenting itself in several republics. So all around Brazil, we had republics, and at the beginning, Brazil was a monarchy. The fact that Brazil has Portuguese as an official language, opposed to the Spanish in the rest of the region, and that it has maintained a large contiguous territorial portion is also important. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world. USA, China, Canada, and Russia are the countries that are larger than Brazil. And it's a giant in the region. Leslie Bettel, a retired professor from Oxford, a Brazilianist, an expert in Brazil, he's living now in Brazil. He published a compelling essay in 2009, emphasizing that Brazil only started to be recognized as part of Latin America in the second half of the 20th century, in the context of Cold War, and even so with several controversies. So it's very interesting that to understand with Brazil, when Brazil became independent, Brazil was very specific. Monarchy, huge territory, Portuguese, totally different from the surrounding region. And even today, it's a big discussion. Is Brazil Latin America? Is Brazil South America? So it's very important to have this past in mind. The role of slavery in Brazilian history is another fact to have in mind. As said, the Portuguese used largely the African captive labor enslaved in the exploration of Brazil. Upon its independence, the Brazilian elite chose to maintain slavery. If forced labor had previously played an essential role in the exploration of gold and sugarcane, in the 19th century, it had an essential role in all the work around coffee production. So I believe that even today we think about Brazil, we think about coffee too. As Professor Luis Felipe de Alencastro, I quote him again, points out, no other American country has practiced slavery on such a large scale as Brazil. Of a total of about 11 million Africans deported and that arrived alive in the Americas, 44%, close to 5 million, came to the Brazilian territory in a period of 3 centuries, from the middle of 16th century to the middle of 19th century. The other big slave country in the continent is United States, practiced the slave trade for little more than a century between 1675 and 1808, and received a much smaller proportion, close to 560,000 Africans. That is 5.5% of the total transatlantic trafficking. Ultimately, Brazil presents itself as the American political aggregate that captured the greater number of Africans and who maintained slavery for a longer time. It's very important to understand that. When we follow today the discussions, exactly these days in US with this topic, when we compare to Brazil here, it was longer, it was maybe harder, and that's a lot of people dealing with that. So another point, it's very, very important, slavery. Throughout the 19th century, alternatives to enslaved labor were discussed in the public spheres. And in fact, there were policies to attract European immigrants in the second half of the 19th century as part of a project of whitening, embranquecimento, to make the country white, and civilizing the country. Between 1865 and 1870, a war was broken in the southern corner of the region, the War of Paraguay. Several Brazilian troops were integrated by slaves that went to the war with the promise of receiving manumission to be free in return after the war. This war was fundamental to the growth of an abolitionist movement in Brazil. So in 1886, 8, slavery was finally abolished, being Brazil the last country in the West. I like this, the West, because elite in Brazil believe that we are West to do so. And in 1889, 1 year after abolition of slavery, not by chance, the monarchy came to an end and Brazil became a republic. So we are a republic since 1889. The law that abolished slavery in Brazil was known as the Golden Law, Lei Áurea. It was signed by the Princess Isabel, and it's considered a conservative law as it abolished slavery, but it was not connected to any de facto policy to insert the former slaves into the Brazilian society. The historian and anthropologist Lilian Moritz Schwartz is one of the academics and public intellectuals who argue that the post-emancipation is not over yet, and many of the structural problems that Brazil faces, especially structural racism and social inequality, derives from it. I just wanted to show you before for Brazilians watching these images, very common, every professor, every teacher use this image, but it's very important to have this in mind of the project of the Brazilian elite with the end of slavery, of whitening and civilizing the country. That's a picture made by Modesto Brocos. He was born in Spain. He immigrated to Brazil in the end of 19th century, so he received the Brazilian citizenship. And it's a woman, a Black woman. We know that she is a slave because she's barefoot, that it was how we knew. And she's praising God. She's thankfully saying that her daughter married a white guy. So her granddaughter, let's say, it's not Black anymore. So that's a big discussion about all not just the idea of whitenizing, but people use racial theories to bring this to Brazil in this time, and we see this even in the pictures of the 19th century. So just a few more information. I'm reading because otherwise it will be a long introduction. I believe that it's interesting to have time for the discussions. So the Brazil of today, of 2021, is a country of 213 million inhabitants. Right now, we live under a general despair, trying to survive the sanity crisis of COVID-19. More than 450,000 Brazilians' lives have been lost and counting. We can talk about this later. As long as there is no mass vaccination program, in fact, there's a mass vaccination program, but it's very slow, and minimal national coordination to contain the virus, we will continue to read about the tragedy in course. I believe that you are following this in Israel. At the same time, during the pandemic, certainly inspired by what's going on in US with all the movement of Black Lives Matter, it is possible to spot in Brazilian public debate more awareness of the unresolved issues of our past, mainly the structural racism. That's in Portuguese, but that's a research of the Brazilian Institute of Statistics and Geography. We see here that more than around 56% of the Brazilians declare themselves to be Black or pardos. I don't know how to translate pardos. Maybe it's miscegenated. So it's very important to have this in mind. So they are most of the country, but they generally occupy the lowest levels of the society. The daily lives of these people often include low wages, offenses, prejudice, racism, and there are very few occupying prominent positions. Silvio Almeida, a philosopher and jurist and one of the prominent people dealing with such public debate in Brazil, points out that racism always ends in death, and it is incompatible with economic development. The racial issue is a pressing one in Brazilian political life, which must be faced urgently and which we must bear in mind all these historical roots that I tried to bring here. So we had in the Brazilian, I will talk about this, but we had in the Brazilian history, first the Portuguese brought the slavery and had this kind of the first slavery. Then when Brazil became independent, the political elite chose to keep the slavery. It's called the second slavery, and that's very important to understand this. And since the end of the slavery, official end of the slavery, the real problem, how to deal with this population, how to include this population, it's still there. And it's impossible to talk about any issue, in my opinion, and of many academics. We have to deal with this elephant in the room. So in Israel, I checked with a Brazilian friend living in Israel yesterday. There's an amazing documentary that you can check on Netflix. That's a Brazilian one, but you have English subtitles called Amarelo. And I don't know if you have these in your classes, but I love using movies and documentaries to discuss the history of Brazil and of Middle East. And this documentary, in my opinion, and of many of my colleagues, is one of the best classes of Brazilian history. Emicida, he's a rapper, a Brazilian rapper, and he organized a concert in a very fancy place in São Paulo called Teatro Municipal. And he brought all his family and people from the periphery of São Paulo, a lot of Black people and poor people, that it was the first time that they went to this amazing place. So that's about his last album. But at the same time, in his documentary, he shows all the history of what I try to explain a little bit here. And it's very interesting because although all the time we feel his pain, how this story is very painful for someone that suffers everyday racism, all the difficulties of living in a periphery of a peripheral country, he brings some hope. And I believe that we need some hope as well. So sorry for my broken English. My second language is Hebrew, and sorry for reading. But as I said, I mean, most of the time I do the opposite. I try to explain the history of Middle East to Brazilians. So I try to bring some topics of a very complex history with a lot of experts. I try to quote some of them. And it's very interesting. One last point before we go to our conversation. It's very important to have in mind that we have a very good institutions and historians, but just a few years from maybe the beginning of new millennium, we have this more global history, people trying to understand more Brazil in the broader perspective. So it's very important to have all this in mind. And at the same time, how history, so that's why I believe that public history is very important. So Luis Felipe de Alencastro, for instance, I quoted him a lot of times, a former professor of Sorbonne. He's one of the advisors to the Brazilian government to have quotas in the university, so to have public policy. So because we are dealing with all these topics, the historical topics, we believe that we have to do a lot more things to solve, to try to solve, not at all, but as much as possible, this problem in Brazilian history, mainly racism, structural racism, because it's everywhere. You see in politics, you see in the culture, you see the economics. So that's the main problem. Since the 19th century, we didn't solve this problem. And if we don't deal with this in a mature way, we can't do anything else, in my opinion. So thank you, Toda, Gabriel. I don't know if it's okay.
We thank you very much. It was a fascinating lecture about a country that we seem to know, and that a country that we seem to think that nothing happens in Brazil. But these last years, the news are telling us the opposite. I hope we are going to discuss about it, and I'm happy that you are here with us. I give the floor to the discussant, a fellow researcher here at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute and the Azrieli Center for Israel Studies, Dr. Omri Shafer-Aviv, who is going to give his own remarks about what we have just heard. Omri, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you and hi everybody, and thank you Monique Zohachevsky for this fascinating talk. And I think, in my opinion, the Brazilian case is a good example to the strong connection between land, labor, immigration, and nation building. And in my response, I wish to elaborate on how this conceptual connection shaped Zionist / Israeli history. First, it must be pointed out that there are huge differences between the Zionist and the Brazilian cases. Brazil is a vast country with enormous land. Israel is a small country with very limited land. Brazil brought millions of African slaves against their will, while the idea of slavery in 19th and 20th century Palestine was unthinkable. In Brazil, Portuguese immigrated into what they perceived as wilderness, and they annihilated the natives in the process of settling the land. In Palestine, Jews recognized the political legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire and later the British mandate, and with it the rights of their non-Jewish inhabitants. And the list of such differences can go on even further. However, despite those significant differences, it is possible, I think, to point out a potential common issue to nation building in Brazil and Israel, and that is the following question. What should be the economic basis of the new society? In Brazil, especially in the 19th century, in Israel, late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. This question derives from the fact that both Brazil and Israel were settler societies. Immigration to the new country and settlement in its lands could not be sustainable without strong economic basis. In the Zionist case, there were two main approaches to this question. One was to rely on cheap Arab labor. Employing cheap labor enabled Jewish settlers to reduce production costs and thus improve the competitiveness of local production in international markets. In this way, the economy was expected to grow, develop, and eventually supply employment opportunities to newcomers. The second approach was to use Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit. This approach fulfilled an ideological principle to transform an unproductive people, quote unquote, into a productive nation, namely a nation with an extensive basis of Jewish manual laborers, just like, in their perception, any other nation of the time. Moreover, ideologically, to bring the Jewish people closer, literally, to the land and soil of their promised land. Even though those were two separate concepts, the goals of the two approaches were mutual: to expand Jewish settlement across the land of Israel, and to expand Jewish immigration to Palestine by creating new employment opportunities. In both cases, the aim was to develop a robust agricultural community as a basis for a future national home. The dispute was how to reach these common goals. The first approach was capitalistic, the second nationalistic and socialist. The first aspired for economic integration with the local Arab population. The second aspired to the separation of the Jewish community from the local Arabs and to create self-reliance of the national economy. Eventually, the economic basis of the Jewish community in pre-1948 mandatory Palestine was a combination of both approaches. The Jewish economy used cheap Arab labor in order to grow economically, for example, in the citrus sector, and secured supply jobs to new Jewish immigrants. by securing employment opportunities for them. In the year 1948, the so-called problem of Arab labor was to a large extent solved as Israel was established as a nation state with only a small Arab minority. Generally speaking, manual labor in the 1950s moved to the hands of new Jewish immigrants from Muslim countries. A new generation of Israelis born around the same time of independence aspired to gain higher education and white-collar professions. In other words, they wanted to be engineers, lawyers, managers, and writers, not blue-collar workers. In the 1970s, Israel was already on the road to become a knowledge-based economy, part of a globalized world economy. This process was completed in the 1990s. Then Israel became known as the startup nation. In the process that transformed the basis of Israel's economy from agriculture to high-tech, a new source of manual labor was found in the parts of the land of Israel which were left beyond the Green Line, after 1948, namely the West Bank and Gaza Strip. There, Israelis found in 1967, not only their ancestors' land, but also the cheap Arab labor they knew from the pre-independence years. In other words, they found potential labor to work in their farms, construction sites, and factories in jobs that Israelis and potential Jewish immigrants no longer wanted. When these Palestinians rebelled, eventually in the 1980s and 90s, Israel simply replaced many of them with new migrant workers from the so-called global South. So in conclusion, the unexpected development in Israeli nation building was that instead of an agricultural-based economy, which is based on cheap Arab labor or Jewish manual labor, we have today a knowledge-based economy based on mostly Jewish workers, which are highly educated and extremely expensive. This workforce uses its Jewish brain, המוח היהודי, rather than its arms. And it spends its days in air-conditioned offices, not under the hot Middle Eastern sun. Indeed, this economy is powerful enough to attract potential Jewish immigrants, or at least prevent out-migration or brain drain from Israel to the tempting markets of the Western world. However, this workforce is more connected in its daily experience to Silicon Valley, London, and Bangalore than to most of the homeland and its inhabitants. Furthermore, this is last sentence, this economy supports the concentration of people and wealth in one international metropolitan and not in the edges of the frontier. I hope these short remarks demonstrate how the connection between land, labor, and immigration continues to shape the face of the Israeli nation in the 21st century, as it did in the 19th and 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this recap of the Israeli nation building so that we can see the differences between Brazilian nation building. Monique, would you like to respond to the response?
Well, for me, it was I was trying to force my brain to work hard to try to make this comparison. I believe that you brought all these topics of the Israeli side, and it's very interesting what you brought. But I was thinking that Brazil still today, although we are 213 million people, although that's with all this specific history that I tried to show you, still the main industry of Brazil is agriculture. And in fact, so coffee, steel, soybean, corn, we sell a lot of chicken to Middle East. I believe that even Israel so it's more agribusiness country, it's the main industry. What is new in the agriculture world in Brazil is technology. So, but as I started my years of the university in Israel, I studied in Turkey. We have now centers of technology and everything, but nothing that we can compare with what you had in Israel in this startup nation. And one thing it's very interesting, in 1920, 2 years ago, I even tried to meet Gabriel in Jerusalem, it was not possible. I was invited, Omri, to go to Israel with 150 Brazilians from an insurance company. That's Icatu. That's a very big insurance company in Brazil. Every year they have a big travel abroad to learn something from a country abroad. And it was very interesting, the idea of the CEOs of these companies. We spent 1 week mainly in Jerusalem. We visited the University of Jerusalem talking about startup. The idea was, you come here to Brazil, we have everything. The nature of Brazil, the potential of this country, it's so big. And at the same time, we have this feeling that if we could be more, I don't know, hard worker, more have the focus on the right policies, it could be for sure an amazing country. So the idea of this travel, for me, it was very interesting from the Brazilian CEOs and the directors of the company, was to go to Israel and to see how, if we see 60% of the country is desert, I don't know. So how they call the necessity was the mother of the creativity. So it was very interesting just to compare the idea of these not 150 Brazilians to try to learn from the Israeli experience. For one side, we have to be more to give value for what we have in Brazil. The Brazilian elite, it's very, still even today, something in Europe is better. That's why I love this discussion about this, if Brazil is West, because for part of the Brazilian elite, we are totally West. So they know what it's the best restaurant in Paris or something like that, but doesn't value what the possibilities of this country. So while you were talking, I had these 2 topics in mind. And the last one about immigrations, how the Jews arrived in all the Zionism idea, the plural Zionism. We know that's political Zionism, cultural Zionism. So I think it's very important to have all these different narratives in mind. But in Brazil, I have a tour guide license as well. And I like to go with my students in normal times to this downtown Rio. Rio was capital of Brazil, so we have a lot of history, buildings, historical buildings here. And at one time I showed them how the Africans, when they arrived in Brazil, mainly Rio received around 1 million, just Rio, around 1 million Africans captives that were enslaved. So we have to know that that's a sad story. When they arrived here, it was to be sold in markets, that people check their teeth. So that's one side that we have to know this and to understand why it's difficult. But at the same time, Omri, at the same region on downtown Rio, a lot of people, especially my grandparents, arrived in this country as a land of relief. So that's a different kind of immigrants. The Brazilian elite in the 1930s, 40s, they didn't like too much, not the Jews and not the Arabs, although most of the Arabs in Brazil are Christians. 85% of the Arabs in Brazil are from Lebanon, Maronites, Melkites, and everything. But it's very interesting because for them, Jews and Arabs were imperfect white. The idea, okay, they were white, let's say, compared to the blacks, but the idea was to whitenize the country. And the Christians of Middle East, that's a different Christianity. They preferred from Portugal, from Italy. And the Jews, the elite have documents, believe that the Jews could be a ethnic. It could be in small groups, not integrating in the huge idea of the country. But even though today, just to come to the Corona times, with all this discussion that we have nowadays, the best hospitals in Brazil dealing with the Corona are the Arab hospital, the hospital in São Paulo, the Sírio-Libanês, and Albert Einstein, the Jewish hospital. Just some topics that I had in my mind while you were comparing to Israel, not exactly the same comparisons, but I think it's interesting to have these in mind. So, toda rabá, Omri. Thank you.
So let's start with the discussion. I see that Professor Caballo wants to ask something, and then Professor Barelli is going to pose his question. So we start this first round, and after this first round, we will continue. I have also some things to ask, but we will talk about it. Professor Caballo, the floor is yours.
Shalom, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay, because I'm still with my phone, so I want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, well, first of all, thank you so much. It's really interesting, and I have to say that after this lecture, it feels like just the beginning. Okay, it really opened the appetite. That's how can the way I describe this experience. So one of the I have many questions that come to my mind, but one of them I'll refer only to two. I'll limit myself. So one is while Omri was comparing this agriculture aspect, the place of agriculture, the place of the land, the connection between man and land, I was thinking about Argentina, naturally, because in Argentina, the gaucho is a figure. We have the chalutz, and Argentina has the gaucho. And I think there's a lot of similarity there. And Omri, thank you for opening my eyes to see something that I saw in front of me, but I never thought to compare. And I wonder whether Brazil has a gaucho model, meaning, is there such an archetype of a Brazilian person who is the archetype of the Brazilian connected to the land? So that's one question. And number two has to do with culture. I visited Brazil once. I have to say it was amazing. I was lucky to be in a conference in Brazil. It was what an experience. The meeting with Brazil, with Brazilians. And one of the things that strikes you when you come from another place, when you come to Brazil, I guess you hear it a lot, so I'm sorry if it's a cliche, but there's something about that culture, the music, the happiness, it seems that for a person who comes from the outside, it seems that there is such a thing as Brazilian culture. And it feels it's a very visual thing. You hear the music wherever you go. It feels that people are communicating with one another through that, through music, through, I don't know, through like they have a common soundtrack, as if they have a common soundtrack. And I wonder to what extent is it in a place that are Brazilians aware of that? Is this something that anyone in Brazil was aware and promoted, or it just happened? Because in Israel, just to compare again, Israeli music, the so-called, I don't know, Shirei Eretz Israel, okay, the land of Israel music is something that was very much, let's say, produced by someone else. It was an infrastructure that was promoted for a certain purpose. Never mind that it also caught the eyes and the soul, the ears and the souls, but it did not happen by itself. These are my two remarks and questions.
Very interesting, and I have to say that this gaucho and the archetype of the Brazilian, it is something that I would like to ask, and Professor Caballo took my question, but I have some more, okay? And the second thing, that whatever I heard from Professor Caballo and what I can imagine, if we did not have this COVID, the next thing that I would do after our meeting to go and book a ticket to come to Brazil. Professor Avi Barelli, it is your turn, and then you answer, Monique, and then we continue.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Zohachevsky. This is the pronunciation, I think, because I wonder if Hebrew is your second language. Why didn't you do it in Hebrew? We are all speaking Hebrew here. But
international audience. What can we do? The next time it will be in Hebrew.
Hebrew is one of the international languages. Okay, no, I'm not serious here. It was very illuminating, your presentation. You know that Brazil fascinates many Israelis. We have, it's interesting why so many Israelis have a soft spot for Brazil, because Brazil is so different than Israel. Maybe it's because Brazil is so different. I don't know. So it was very interesting, naturally. And calling for questions, I will contribute a few. During the 50s and the 60s, Brazil was part of a group of fast-growing nations, including Israel, Brazil, Israel, Taiwan, South Korea, were typically high, rapid developing countries with high rate of fast developing economies. But there is a difference, striking difference between Brazil from one side, Israel and Taiwan and South Korea on the other. So, and I'm using here Taiwan and Korea because it's not a matter of West and East, or South, or North and South, as Omri called immigration rightfully. I think it's something else, and I wonder whether you have what is your own, what is the explanation you think is more adequate? I would say that Brazil is suffering from deep racial problems that were prominent in your presentation, of course, and as a matter of result or not, I don't know, from very deep structural social inequality. Maybe this is the direction. And then I want to ask you about the relations between race and nationalism and race and religion in Brazil. Concerning nationalism, Brazilian nationalism, you spoke few about, you didn't enlarge on Brazilian nationalism. I want to ask you, is it transgender, racial? Does the Brazilian nationalism belong, so to speak, to all races? Are the blacks considered part and parcel of Brazilian nationalism, and are they do they adhere naturally to Brazilian nationalism? That's one. That's the second question. And the third question I wanted to pose here concerning religion is it concerns the late decades. We see a tremendous rise in evangelical Christianity in Brazil. This is something that has, I would say, great importance in terms of geostrategic. When you consider worldwide processes, it's an amazing process that takes place not only in Brazil but all over South America and in Central America. And I wanted to ask you, what is the racial background of this and tremendous growth of evangelism? Does this religion has a special ability to address the Black communities in Brazil, and how does it? If yes, if the answer is positive, how do they do it?
Thank you. Can I start answering, Gabriel? Yes?
Yes, of course.
So I'll do from the end to the beginning, okay? And while you were asking questions, Professor Avi and Professor Caballo, I was distributing the possible answers for my colleagues dealing specific with all these topics. So the rise of evangelical is very important in Brazilian politics now, and in the relations between Brazil and Israel, the current government of Brazil and Israel. So Professor Guilherme Casarões, he was a fellow at Brandeis as well as me and Professor Gabriel. He's doing an amazing research about that. There's a lot of people. What is interesting when we see the broader picture, as I said, from the Portuguese and everything, Brazil, the idea was to bring Catholicism. The Portuguese were very Catholic, Christians of Catholic, from the Catholic branch. So there were a huge project to evangelize the Black people and the indigenous people. But one thing is very important, connected to your other question, is that the Afro-Brazilians kept many of them the Afro-Brazilian religions. And for them, Ubanda, Macumba, I don't know exactly the name, it's very important to their culture. It's a kind of mix of Africa and Catholicism, and it was very important. And always they suffered from prejudice, and now it's worse. But regarding the evangelical, so Brazil for most part of the time was mainly Catholic, but in the last decades, it's amazing how it's called the Neo-Pentecostal, this branch of the evangelicals. It's not just converting a lot of Brazilians, but there is a project of power, not just in Brazil. That's one of these churches is very active in Africa. I won't name it, but I think it's very interesting to see how maybe we can compare to US, and it's a lot of comparisons for what's going on in United States. And so in the last years, they started maybe in small cities, in small chambers of congressmen, let's say, but now we see this mix, and it's one thing very important to understand Brazil of Bolsonaro. He himself, his surname, we understand that he has Italian background, Catholic background, but he was converted into evangelical. And one of the bases of his power, I should say military is one branch, another branch, it's one philosopher, people that follow one philosopher, but this evangelical branch is very strong. So I don't know all the numbers and everything, but what is interesting that and the left wing of Brazil, it's asking, we are having a kind of asking ourselves what happened, why the left, why PT has these laws and everything. One of the reasons is that people didn't pay attention of the importance of these evangelical branches, that they accepted people, they went to the prisons, they had projects to bring people that were in the periphery and had problems. So it's very important topics. I can send you more articles with numbers, with researches of my colleagues about this rise of evangelical, but for sure, that's one of the most important things. And all the time I have discussions in Brazil, I say, oh, you complain about religion in the Middle East? Come on, we have religion all around in the politics. And one thing that is very sad, that people that has these religions, Afro-Brazilian religions, sometimes even in Rio, they have their special places with all the performing. Sometimes groups of evangelical groups go there and they destroy. So we have something that the idea of Brazil, of very kind people that receives everyone with open arms as the Corcovado, as the Christ the Redeemer, it's not exactly like that, and religion is a very important component. The second, from the opposite side, do you want to add something, Professor?
No, just wanted to ask if it has racial background. Do they address especially the blacks or the colored in Brazil?
I don't see that specifically, but there are a lot of Black people from the periphery that found in these churches, in these movements, a place of worship, a place to be included. As I said, we have this structural racism. So I don't believe that's something specific, but and even there's this kind of fight with the Afro-Brazilian religions. Sometimes maybe inside one same family, you have branches in different sides. I don't know, I have to do a research to answer it exactly, but if that's targeted, but a lot of people from the periphery, from the low scales of the society are following these branches of evangelical. So it's we have all the time to try to understand the society, the intersectional thing. Regarding nationalism in Brazil, it's a very interesting question, because we are asking ourselves, what is Brazil? Because the current government, they hijacked the Brazilian flag. So if you use a Brazilian flag today, it seems that's a statement that you are pro-Bolsonaro, because that's a discussion. If you see on Sunday, there was a parade here in Rio. All the time you see Brazilian flags very connected. So the idea of this new movement of patriotism, of we have to be strong, to be proud of our history, but a history that they say that all these people that complain about the structural racism, they are doing me. It's kind of you are complaining of something that's not so important as you say. That's a kind of it's very interesting to historians to deal what's going on in Brazil now. The idea is to rewrite the history of Brazil, and so the nationalism in Brazil, it's a big issue. What is to be a nationalist in Brazil all around this? During the 19th century, there was a contest in the middle of 19th century, won by one European, how to understand the history of Brazil. And the idea was that we are mixed. So we had the Portuguese, the Black, and the indigenous. So we are a kind of racial democracy. We are made by a kind of as it was not violent. So during a long time, all the Brazilian projects, some governments, Getúlio Vargas Foundation, the name of the institution where I had my PhD and postdoc, the idea was to kind this huge country to have a common narrative, and one of them was of the racial democracy. But and it was used with a lot of symbols and music and everything. But in the last years, mainly, a lot of people say, wow, we have to understand that when we have miscegenation, a lot of time it was through rape. That's violence. We have to take this into account. So that's a big discussion about the nationalism. What is the nation of Brazil? If Brazil doesn't deal, if the elites doesn't deal with a mature way with this tragic history. Do you understand? So that's one of the topics for your question about race and nationalism, and connect maybe to the other questions. Regarding the 50s.
Oh. Okay, no, we will solve it. We have solved it with Zimbabwe. We will solve it also with Brazil. We will win.
But we will do it faster than with the Zimbabwe.
I will do my best. I am not, אני לא הכל יכול.
לא.
יש לנו סבלנות, הכל בסדר.
מניאנה. אגב, מרענן להיפגש בשעות כאלה.
אני מסכימה, זה דווקא נחמד. בלו בו.
זה לילה לבן, זה משמרת.
מרענן זו ממש המילה האחרונה שהייתי בוחרת, אבל האחרונה.
חוץ מהקטע של להשאיר ילדים לישון תוך כדי.
אנחנו לא יכולים להתחרות בעייפות שלה.
לא, אתם באמת שלא.
תדעו שאנחנו בלייב עכשיו בפייסבוק, אז אוקיי, עוד מעט היא מתחברת. אנחנו עדיין בלייב, זה לא נתקע, אנחנו בשידור חי.
לא נעשה שום דבר מבייש.
רק ש...
כל העולם
לכם, כאילו.
יש פה איזה משהו
אגב, אני מאוד אוהב את השעה הזאת. זה יותר טוב מ10 בבוקר.
מדהים, מה אתה מתפלא?
היא הולכת, היא מתחברת עוד מעט, היא יודעת שהיא תקועה, אז... אבל אל תדאגו, כשאנחנו נעלה את המפגש שלנו בזה, יהיה אחרי יהיה מוכן וערוך והכל יהיה בסדר.
פתאום אני רואה כלב באחד הריבועים.
הנה.
אוי, מה זה החמידות הזאת? מי זה?
איזה חמוד.
Okay. So, Monique, now I see that you are talking from, okay, it's the audio. You are muted. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
I'm sorry.
It doesn't matter from your, so please continue. We are with you and we have, yes.
I'm really sorry. It never happened. Something in the internet. So I don't know if I was in the middle of the answer. I was trying to answer the question about the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Excuse me, Monique. One moment. Omri Dinur, please mute yourself. Yeah. Thank you. You can continue.
Please let's mute all of us except of Monique. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. So about the 50s and the 60s with the Asian tigers, I was telling that I visited Singapore, and one of the things, one very famous writer, a Jewish from Austria called Stefan Zweig, he wrote when he fled the Nazis into Brazil, and he published a book called Brazil, the Country of the Future. So it's common, we all the time use this idea that Brazil, as I said, with a lot of potential, it will be the country of the future. So in the 60s, especially the end of the 60s, with the dictatorship in Brazil, that was the economic miracle during the years of Medici government. And in fact, there was all this idea that, okay, now Brazil will be developed. So there are a lot of infrastructures projects, a lot of, even with all the oil problem, Brazil developed more its industry in the oil and gas, and we have a very important industry in this topic. So during these years, yes, it was the idea, the impression that Brazil will be a developed country during the Lula's years as well, in the beginning of the millennium. But I believe that social inequality, not dealing with these structural problems is one side, and not having, I worked 2 years for one of the most important think tanks in Brazil, and all the time we had a discussion about what is the project of the country. So what is the strategic project of the elite of Brazil for this country? So I believe that maybe in Israel, if you have this, please share with me, because sometimes I have this impression to Israel as well. So maybe this lack of a strategic project in the long run, this culture of the politics that every new government starts from the beginning, the idea, okay, I'm totally different party, so I don't keep public policies that were working. So discontinuity maybe is the word. So 2 times I can say, maybe the 60s during the dictatorship as well. So what you're doing, a lot of, let's say, important projects in the economic and everything, but human rights, and it's in the bad situation. So we have these two moments, the beginning of new millennium as well. I don't know if you remember the cover of The Economist, Brazil rising power. We had all these international events in Brazil, World Cup, Olympics. I was so excited. Okay, now we go. Now we will understand the potential of our country and how the world will understand this potential. But in fact, we had not solving the basic problems, all this polarization. And so I believe it's that. And when we compare to the Asian side, it's different to Israel. It's totally different as well. So for Professor Omri, no, it's, for these questions, I will answer that. And for Professor Caballo, I love your questions. I believe that you have Argentinian background, maybe for your name. And it's interesting when Brazil is so big. So I try to show all the time, see the map of Brazil. We have 10 borders, all the South Atlantic we have in our border as well. It's totally inside Brazil. More than 50% of Brazil is Amazon, and Amazon. I went once, and it's another world. So we have the Gaucho culture in the south part of Brazil, and they even use the word Gaúcho. The Rio Grande do Sul, Paraná, and Santa Catarina, it's quite different because in these countries, in the southern part of Brazil, the agriculture was different. It was part of the project. The elite brought people from Italy and from Germany, especially. So we have, even today, people come from these countries because in many villages, with a lot of agriculture culture, with wine, as in Argentina as well, a lot of culture of the meat, that in this area of Brazil, not just the agribusiness in general. In many villages, people keep here the dialects of Italy and German that nowadays it's lost in Europe, and sometimes people come here to learn more. So this Gaucho country, they even, it's, you know, the border in the south of Brazil between Uruguay and Argentina, sometimes you have the common culture among these areas. But yes, we have, but mainly in the southern part of Brazil, and it's very interesting to learn more about these three states of Brazil, because Brazil is huge. And regarding music, yes, music is happiness. And I believe that nowadays we are 14 months inside home because there is no, in Israel you complained about lockdown, but you solved the problem. You had 3 lockdowns, you have vaccination. Here we don't have lockdown. The vaccination is very slow, a lot of problems. But one thing that maybe keep us sane is music. There's one very famous singer, Teresa Cristina. Every night she has a live on her, not Facebook, Instagram. And it's a kind of, we can, I don't know, we can feel sane for a few moments. But what is interesting here, a lot of anthropologists and colleagues, even colleagues during my PhDs, are dealing with the music of Brazil. When you think about music and carnival and all this happiness, it's a kind of escape for one side. Carnival is the time of the year when the poor people become kings, when the poor people of the periphery can have, you know, all these gold and all these clothes as nobles. So there's one historian, Luis Antonio Siemens, that he writes a lot about this, how in music, it's a kind of resistance as well. So samba, one of the most important music in Brazil, there are all the, now we say, oh, samba is very Brazilian, a lot of famous singers, but it was a fight all the time. They have to, all the time, to impose the culture. As I said, the documentary of Emicida, I really recommend if you want to understand Brazil, of the rap. He says, we, the rappers, we have all this place now in the Brazilian culture because the people from the samba, from the MPB, the popular music, Brazilian music. I know that in Israel people love Gilberto Gil. Noah made a Hebrew version of his music, his song Shalom. And so I think it's very interesting, this kind of music. For one side, especially these days, this government, that it's very hard for many people in Brazil, that the culture is not the main topic. All the people that from the culture world are suffering from many problems, mainly economic. So culture is very important, and we can smile for a while. but there's a lot of studies with this topic. What we can find in the Brazilian music, what is this happiness? Maybe it's this happiness, it's more, we can learn more about the suffering of the people when we deal with this happiness.
Thank you very much for your remarks. And I have to say that my first acquaintance with the Brazilian music was through Israel, with Mati Kaspi, Eretz Tropit Yafa. So I can understand what you talk about, and our viewers who know about Israeli pop music in the late 70s might remember. Professor Gofer has some questions, and then I have some also. Please get prepared for your last questions. When you want, you can raise your hand through chat. So, Professor Gofer, is your turn.
I'm not a professor, I'm a doctor, but okay. So I have a very specific question, which is very interesting to me. You talked about the royal visit, and it's significant to the national building of Brazil. And I wanted to ask about that. What was the significance of this visit of the royal coming to Rio? And you talked about the places that were open and a city that became alive. But what is the significance to the national building? I can see it. It can be like a very nice example to other things that are very small but have a huge significance. So,
and
yes.
I would like to add a question that is connected with Dr. Gofer's question. If I know well, I have the impression that the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, is a city that it was constructed and scheduled from nothing in order to become the capital of Brazil. So when I heard your historical aspect of nation building, the place that it should be the capital is Rio. But it's or wherever, or Sao Paulo, or whatever but at the end of the day, they have decided in Brazil to create a capital from the beginning. And I think that this has to do how the conception of nation building was perceived in Brazil at that time. Please enlighten us why a country like this, an old country at the end, had to invent and schedule from nowhere, from nothing, a capital. The second thing that I would like to ask you, the racial thing is important, as you have said. I wonder, do we have any political leader who was representing black Brazilians as Martin Luther King? It is a question. If we do have, I would like to know about it. If we don't have, it is important to find out why. And the last one, the controversy about the president of Brazil right now. Does it have a racial parameter? Is the president of the whites? Is he the president of the blacks? What is he? Why is there a controversy not only about the authoritarianism or not authoritarianism, because the main issue, as I have understood, is race. Do we have such a parameter? I think that we have finished. I mean, I would like to have your answers.
Thank you, Gabriel and Professor Dr. Gofer. I try to do one answer about capital, about Rio and about Brasilia. So, and I love this topic. It's one of the topics of my PhD. One of the reasons I wrote and I lived in Turkey, it was because when I read the book of Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel of Literature in 2006, Istanbul, History and Memoirs, I read that he was talking about Rio. He said about Istanbul, that was a capital of a former empire that lost the capitality to Ankara and fell the Hujun. So for me, it was exactly the idea of Rio. So I love this topic. One thing is very important, Gabriel, that the first capital of Brazil when the Portuguese governed here was Salvador in Bahia. A lot of Israelis go there up to the 18th century. In the 18th century, the Portuguese, the people here found gold in Minas Gerais. Minas is a state inside the territory. So to bring the gold to the coast to Portugal, if you come here to Rio, I will take you to the sugar loaf. The sugar loaf, I took Professor Eli Reges here once. From the sugar loaf, you understand the geostrategic importance of Rio. That's a narrow entrance to the huge bay. So it's very easy to protect. It was easy in this time. And from here, from Rio especially, Rio became capital in the 18th century up to the middle of 20th century. In the beginning, because it was from here that the Portuguese received the gold. So that's the reason. So Rio was the capital. Exactly, Dr. Gopher, when the royal family decided that they could go, Professor Luis Alencastro said they could go to Madeira and to Azores because it was islands that Portuguese belonged to Portugal. So they could be safe during the war and go back to Lisbon. But with the help of the British that was interested in Brazil as well, they came to Rio. And so Rio was the capital at the beginning of one of the many colonies of Portugal, but then Rio became the capital of the overseas empire, and they brought part of the bureaucracy with them. So the royal, even today, UNESCO recognizes the Brazilian Library of Memory of the World, because we have part of our library. People that want to learn about history of Portugal have to come to Rio when there's no corona, because they brought from Portugal the royal library. So they established banks, they established all these institutions. And we can compare maybe I'm crazy, tell me about, I was reading Rashid Khalidi chapter about the reasons of the fail of the Palestinian state. And he says that during the mandate, the Jews of Palestine established a lot of institutions that were very important when Israel was born. So you had all these experience already for a state. So maybe we can compare to this when the Portuguese brought all these institutions to Rio. So the people that come here, the natives, have part of the elite of Portugal that decided to live here. So we have this experiment as well. So we can be independent. I don't know if these comparisons make sense, but it came to my mind. So it's very important of this presence. So a lot of people say that officially Brazil became independent in the September 7th of 1822. But to understand 1822, we have to understand 1808, when they arrived here with all these institutions, with all these previous experiment to be independent. So I believe it's interesting for your questions. And Brasilia, Gabriel, there was a lot of discussions during the time to move the capital, because here we have all the institutions with people around. People can go striking, people can go to demonstrate in front of the important building. Brasilia official idea as Ankara is the idea. I lived in Ankara, you know. It's not nice.
No,
I love Istanbul.
Yes, it's a hard time. It's a hard place to stay. I have been also, yes.
I loved Bilkent University. If someone from Bilkent is watching, I love Bilkent.
Except of that, yeah.
But the idea of Ankara and of Brasilia is to be in the middle of the land, and it was symbolic. And Brasilia was a project of Niemeyer as well. You know that University of Haifa in Israel? He's the architect, a Brazilian, a very important architect. So the project of Brasilia, it's a kind of airplane. So you have the wings, and the idea was to be in the middle of the territory of Brazil. So not Rio, not São Paulo, not Minas, something new. And
Ben-Gurion had a similar idea. He wanted it to be in what is now Dimona, near Dimona in Mamshit. So that this is the center of Israel, and we have to have our capital there. Just an idea.
I didn't know. I know that he moved to Mitzpe Ramon to kind of bring people to live in the desert, but I didn't know about this idea of the capital. So 3 capitals. Rio became capital because gold was important, but then Rio became important because many things. We had here, if we compare to Istanbul, I have depression because we had here everything, all the institutions, the bureaucracy, the good universities and everything. When Brazil lost the capitality to Brasilia in 1960, so Brasilia became the political capital of Brazil. It's very important. I work for a university in Brasilia, but São Paulo became the most rich country, the rich state of Brazil. And now Minas Gerais is the most important commercial, industrial state of Brazil. So we have a depression here, a huge zoom, as in Istanbul in the past, because we have a lot of history and it's very difficult, the situation, especially of Brazil right now. So I believe the discussion about capital is very interesting. Gabriel, about a leader, a Black leader, officially this agenda of anti-racism, of inclusion, it's connected to the left of Brazil. And so the PT made a lot of things, the Workers' Party, during their years in the presidency, in the government. They made a lot of things to include more, to that now in the schools, they have to study the history of Africa and everything, but Lula is not Black, and then maybe Marina Silva. I believe that there's some popular politicians that deal with this topic, but not from the community, let's say. But in the public debate, it's very important during the pandemic. We see more and more journalists, now Global News, a very important network, because of the discussion of Black Lives Matter last year. The first day they had just white journalists discussing this topic. Everyone was angry, I was one of them. In the next day, they have just Black journalists discussing that. It's important. And so now we have, public people dealing with this more with this topic, but I don't recognize someone from the community, let's say, as this leader. I can check, maybe I'm wrong. And about Bolsonaro, the idea of these people, it's that they are against political correctness. So they want to call someone in the words that I don't use. And they say that all these things, this thing regarding feminism, regarding racism, it's a kind of political correctness. They want to say what they say. That's the liberty of expression. And but there are women and there are Black people that follow Bolsonaro. All the time I ask myself, how? Because all these public statements, it's very, very sensitive in these issues. But there are followers and people that work with him, even politicians from these groups as well. But I'm not an expert in this topic, Gabriela. I believe that we have the discussion. I'm more a citizen, a Brazilian citizen that decided to live in Brazil. I lived in Israel, I lived in Turkey, I traveled all around the world. I love Brazil. I think that this country is full of potential, but now you are in the Holy Land, pray for us, because there's no adult in the recent. We don't know, there's no project to deal with the virus, so it's very difficult. So I don't know if I answered. Sorry for my broken English.
Your English is perfect, and also my English is broken. I think that we have concluded with all the questions, and I think that we had also a very good time. It's a good idea that we met at 8 o'clock in the evening in Israel, while in Brazil it's 2:30. I know that it will not happen again, but I would like to happen again. I'm very happy also that we have concluded the series of the lectures with such a great friend who is Monique. I met her at Brandeis in Boston, and I hope that we will meet again. It was a pleasure to see you again. And it was a pleasure to see everybody of you, every one of you here. Okay, I hope that we will meet again in Sde Boker, and not only via Zoom. Soon, now that we have ended, and with the virus, and with the missiles, and with everything, and Hamsa Hamsa, yes. All the good luck. I was surprised to hear that the bad luck is called Greek eye in Brazil, but I think that we will have another Zoom in order to explain this.
Yes.
So have a good evening, everyone here in Israel and
the
rest of the world in the East, and good afternoon in the West, far West, in Brazil, that you have also winter. That's another thing that we have to another Zoom.
Tropics, we are in the tropics, Gabriel.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. I had a wonderful time, and today and the other times. And now that I feel that I am more confident on the camera, now we are on the 5th lecture. I had to try all this thing the fourth times before. Thank you. Bye. And what?
Just a moment.
Yes.
Because Monique is speaking Hebrew, I'll allow myself to switch to Hebrew.
Please do.
ולומר לך, זה הפגישה האחרונה שאתה בסדרה הזאת, ואנחנו, אני יודע, לפני הסיכום, בסיכום זה הסיכום, הוא עומד בפני עצמו, ולומר לך שזו הייתה הצלחה גדולה, ואנחנו, אני חושב שאני אומר את זה בשם כל חברי הקבוצה, ממש מודים לך.
אני לא הייתי לבד, I wasn't the only one, and שחר, רים, and עומרי, שפר,
זה היה המשפט הבא שלי.
helped a lot.
תנו לו לדבר, גבי.
זה היה המשפט הבא שלי.
צריך להגיד את זה.
אוקיי, פרקת את זה. אז אנחנו מודים גם לחברי הוועדה שלך, לשחר ולעומרי, ומי עוד היה איתך? תזכיר לי.
מה זה?
אנחנו שלישייה.
אנחנו השלישייה.
אוקיי.
השלישייה הקדושה, השילוש הקדוש.
הצלחתם מאוד, ואנחנו מודים לכולכם, במיוחד לך, גבריאל, בכל זאת. תודה רבה.
תודה, גבריאל.
תודה רבה, תודה רבה.
תודה רבה, תודה לכולכם.
כל הכבוד לכולם.
תודה, ביי. אני צריכה ללמד.
ביי, להתראות.
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 תודה רבה.